You're listening to Recovery Queen Melissa Presents Tales from the Trap. I'm your host, Melissa McMillan. I'm a recovering addict, a human trafficking survivor, and yes, a human trafficking convict. I spent 20 years living in active addiction, experiencing things most couldn't imagine. This podcast is where we tell the truth about the streets, about the system, about survival, recovery, trauma, and the people who never made it out. These stories are raw, real, and sometimes they're hard to hear, but you know what? They matter. This is Tales from the Trap. Hello. So tonight I was a guest speaker for Angels of Hope Against Human Trafficking, and I screen recorded the whole thing, and it has no volume. Of course. So I'm going to read the story to you because it's really good. It's going to be in 3 parts because it's about 30 minutes long, and I'm just going to get into it. So, hello, my name is Melissa McMillan, and today I'm here to tell my story. What I'm not here to do is sugarcoat anything. My story is raw and unfiltered and unfortunately extremely common. I'm going to tell you my perspective on the industry of exploitation, an industry that I was in and out of for almost 15 years. But tonight, I'm going to call it sex work because that's what we're supposed to call it now. That's the politically correct term. Not prostitution, sex work. So my perspective may not be your perspective, and that's okay. All I ask is that you take in what I'm sharing with an open mind and an open heart. And at the end, if you have any questions or want any clarifications, I implore you to ask. But for right now, I would just love for you to listen. First, it's important to me that you understand this. The Human Trafficking Act of Canada is made up of offenses that many women and men in active addiction are committing every single day without even realizing it. And here's another hard truth. The likelihood of somebody who's been exploited in the past going on to exploit other people and bringing other women into the industry is very high. That's what happened in my life and in the lives of hundreds of women that I've heard from over the last 4 years since I came out publicly with my story. My story, like I said, is raw, but it's also full of accountability, and I think that's what makes it special. I don't tell my story to glorify or vilify anyone. And I don't tell it to trigger you either. So if anything I say tonight brings up something in you, please reach out to Angels of Hope for support and guidance. So quickly before I start, I want to read you a message I recently received from another survivor, but also a woman who was charged under the Human Trafficking Act. It reads, I have a similar story, girl. Same DOC, same charges, similar sentencing, and I also am a mom. I've been in recovery for over 2 years. It'll be 3 in January. And hearing you take responsibility and being so raw and open has really helped me internally cope with some of the choices that I made in active addiction now that I'm no longer there. Your platform does make a difference. Thank you. So I was introduced to the sex work industry by a girl I went to elementary school with. Okay, it was the same girl that I ended up contracting hepatitis C from. Same girl who introduced me to IV drugs. She showed me how to do sex work. And back then, we were using Plenty of Fish dating apps. That's how we found our Johns. And when I say Johns, I mean men who pay for sex. This was 2011. I was 26 and I had just given my 4-year-old daughter over to my parents to take care of because the domestic violence and the drug use in our home had gotten really bad. Shortly after she went to live with them, her father had actually put me in the hospital. He came home drunk after work one night, angry about something. He pulled a drawer out of our dresser and smashed me in the head with it, and he just left me there. If it wasn't for the upstairs tenants hearing me screaming, someone call 911, I'm dying, I probably wouldn't have even made it. In 2011 in Sudbury, my hometown, they were going through an OxyContin epidemic. Pharmacies were being robbed left and right. Pharmacists were being arrested. And the methadone clinics, the couple that we had at the time had months long wait lists, and I couldn't get on a program. My little brother, who's a couple years younger than me, would actually go out and buy methadone on the streets. He would come to my apartment, this little room that I was renting, not an apartment. He would come before work and he would dose me so I wasn't sick. That's how it started. That's how the sex work started for me. It wasn't to live a fancy life. It wasn't for extra income. It was to survive opiate withdrawal, which is how a lot of women get in the industry. I started using drugs at a really young age, okay, around 14. And when people ask why I started using drugs in the first place, I have a really hard time answering that because I had a really good childhood. I had 2 loving parents in the home. I grew up in the suburbs. I had a big pool in the backyard I didn't want for nothing. I even went to Disneyland. And I had a lot of friends. But I also had a predisposition to addiction. By the time I was 17, somebody had offered me OxyContin. I didn't even know what they were. It was my friend's stepdad. He was selling 10 milligram OxyContins for $5. At the time, we were partying, going to raves, just harmless experimenting, ecstasy and stuff. And someone gave me an Oxy and said it would make me feel better. Before I knew it, I was walking into my first methadone clinic. So I'm going to fast forward a bit to when I got pregnant in 2013. I had managed to get clean for a bit. I was off the streets. I was doing much better, but for me, past behavior is a really good predictor of future behavior. And I knew the sobriety and being out of the sex work industry wasn't going to last. So in 2014, I had another daughter. My 2 youngest were only 14 months apart. Now that's 3 little girls. I was doing better. I was what you would call a functioning addict. And what I mean by that is I had a home and a car and food in the fridge, and I wasn't selling my body to get high anymore. On the outside, we looked like a beautiful little family, and for a while, things were great. Raising my girls with their dad those years were some of the best times of my life. But in 2016, my partner, who had a bad drug addiction himself, showed me IV cocaine. And within 90 days, my family had taken our kids. I was back out into the streets, and I was doing sex work. That's how fast it can happen. 90 days. And that's why I don't like the term functioning addict, because in my experience, you're only functioning until you're not. So this is the beginning of my first experience with human trafficking and exploitation. My partner, who was deep in his disease, and as was I, but he was having horrible bouts of psychosis. He started to be involved in my sex work. At first, it was me fully willing to make money that way, so him and I could get high. There was no shift that I could pinpoint. Now looking back, it was just 1 minute. He was going along with it, just happy that we had money to get high, and the next, he was very involved. It quickly, by definition, became human trafficking. He would set up dates. He would take me to sleep with his friends. He would wait in the driveway, or he'd make me trade sex for drugs to drug dealers. And then when I started working out on Kathleen, out in the open, he would sit there. He would sit there and watch me. Sometimes men would even go to him to negotiate. I remember being so scared to take too long with these dates because he would get so upset. Like this one time I was coming back with a John driving in his truck. And as we were coming closer to Kathleen, I could hear my partner screaming my name. Melissa! I knew in that moment I had taken too long, and I was terrified because I knew it was going to be bad. Till this day, anybody calling my name, even my own dad, triggers me. I have horrible PTSD from what I experienced out there. So people started to quickly notice what was going on with him and I. People in the community saw what was happening. Businesses in the area and their customers would call the cops and say, hey, I think this girl is being pimped out. And the police would show up and I would lie to their faces and say, no, I'm doing this all on my own. He's just there to protect me, even though he was taking all of my money. Sometimes there was violence, but not always. Most of the time, it was just threats that he would hurt me if I didn't hand over money or drugs, or he'd do really weird sexual things that I've never even talked about till this day. One day, he had a really bad episode of psychosis, and I took off because at this point, he wasn't even making any sense. So I was with this girl for a couple days, and we ended up going back to the stroll to try to make more money for a hotel. That's when I got in the wrong car. I had made a deal with two men, two disgusting human beings, who assaulted me and threw me out of the car naked. Well, not naked. I had a sheer lingerie like house coat on with nothing underneath. I was completely exposed. And I just remember getting up and running to this girl, another working girl that I had saw. It was actually a girl I went to high school with, and she had a backpack and she gave me clothes. And I remember her and the guy she was with trying to get me to call the cops. This assault at the time just reinforced the idea that I needed my partner to survive out there, that it wasn't safe without him. And that's what kept him and I in the vicious cycle of substance abuse and sex work. Now I want to say something, and this may be hard for you to understand or believe, but my partner at the time was really sick, okay? He was in some of the darkest times of his life. And I can't tell you that if the roles were reversed, if I was the man and he was the woman, that I wouldn't have done the exact same thing because I was sick too. Now, this is the part that may be hard to understand, but I don't hold any ill will towards him. I actually forgive him for everything that happened. It was over almost a decade ago. Okay. And since then, he worked really, really hard to change his life. And I would never want to take away from his achievements by telling this story. But what I didn't know then that I do now is that what he did was human trafficking. Nobody can be involved in your sex work. No one can intimidate you into giving them money that you made. Nobody. That's human trafficking. This is something I wasn't even aware of. I didn't even know that I was a survivor. Not until the courts forced me to do survivors counseling after I had been arrested. So when I came out with my story 4 years ago and started sharing it online, the amount of women that came out and said, I didn't know I was trafficked either. My boyfriend did the exact same thing. I resonate with so much of what you're saying. It became overwhelming to hear these stories, and it's still overwhelming to hear them today. But that's when I started looking into statistics, and statistically, it's extremely common. Approximately 1/3 of trafficking survivors say they were trafficked by intimate partners. And let me tell you, the amount of women in active addiction who told me that their partners made them turn tricks for drug money or made them trade sex to drug dealers has also been overwhelming. And that's a good segue into my next experience with exploitation. I'm going to talk about how men who sell drugs are often also involved in human trafficking because I didn't have a typical relationship with the man who exploited me. He wasn't my pimp. He was my drug dealer. He was someone that I had known for like a decade at the time, and how he ended up reaching out to me and how we reconnected, he posed as a John. He called, he set a date, and he pulled up. When I got in the car, he told me that he could help me, that I shouldn't be using Plenty of Fish to do calls. He had a much better way. He told me I could post ads on Backpage. That night, He proceeded to trade drugs for sex, and I got pregnant. Not long after this, he gave me a phone, and that phone would ring with dates. He put up ads with my pictures, ads that I never saw, and a phone that would ring night and day with John's. My boyfriend called it the trick phone. He even made a deal with a woman in active addiction so I could trick out of her apartment. When all this was happening back then in 2016, I was actually convinced that he was helping me because he never took money from me. He wasn't my pimp, no, but he was my drug dealer. And he knew every dime I made would go back to him. Eventually, we lost touch, but 9 months later, June of 2017, I had that baby. I was living on the streets at the time and went from labor and delivery right to the mental institution. The baby, he was adopted by a family friend. Ironically, she's the same woman who called 911 back in 2011 when my boyfriend smashed me in the head with that dresser drawer. After that had happened, we became friends. And Jamie Lee has always been my saving grace. And I owe her an eternal gratitude for adopting that baby boy and giving him the beautiful life that he has today. Later, the drug dealer, the man who had given me that phone, he was arrested for human trafficking and sexual assault. In 2019, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but it had nothing to do with me. But I did meet the woman who was his victim in detox back after the baby was born. She told me what happened, and that's when I realized this is just what he does. And it's sad to say, but that man is back in our community today, free as we speak. So from 2018 to 2020, I was in and out of jail. Okay, rehabs, institutions, detox, deep in active addiction and sex work. I had an apartment, what looked like stable housing. I was even seeing my kids, even though they were in the custody of everybody else. But I was doing sex work and drugs every day. There were other girls that were staying with me too, who were doing sex work also, and we would just pool whatever money we made to get drugs. That's how we lived. That was our day to day. In October 2020, I had just gotten out of the mental institution because I had a really bad fentanyl overdose that scared me. I ended up staying in the hospital for over 3 months doing 13 rounds of shock treatment. I would have done anything to get better at that point, but nothing worked. It was in the middle of COVID, and I was walking into my apartment building when I met a girl. I knew as soon as I met her, she had mental health problems or something. She was much older than me, but she acted a lot younger. She asked if I could get her speed pills, and I did, and we ended up hanging out for a few days doing drugs, but then she wouldn't leave. She had no money and wouldn't stop begging my friends for drugs. I told her she couldn't just be sitting here begging people for drugs, that she had to go. My friends were getting pissed. That's when she said, I want to do what you girls are doing. I remember looking at my girlfriend and her just being like, no, Mel, no. But I didn't listen. Because I had done this before. I've helped women before. I've helped women make money in that way before. So I asked her, have you ever done this before? And she was like, yeah, absolutely, which I found out later was true. But I also found out that she had accused other women of forcing her into sex work. That I found out much later, after I got arrested. So, like I had many times before, I helped her. I made her an ad on Craigslist. I was the only one with a working phone, so I took pictures and I set it all up for her, and they would call my phone for her. So there's a loyalty among girls in the industry, working girls. We look out for each other. We would all much rather help each other make money than have a pimp. And it wasn't like anyone was being forced to do anything ever. But it was definitely exploitation. I say it's exploitation because sex work is legal, sure, but bringing other women into the industry and helping someone do sex work is not. No one could put up ads for you. No one could drive you to dates. No one can arrange dates. No one can take photos. And that's why I implore people to actually look at the Human Trafficking Act of Canada and realize what it actually is, because it's a list of offenses that a lot of women in active addiction commit parts of without realizing it every day. So she did a couple calls. Then she accused an old regular of mine of being rough with her. It all started to get really strange. Like, this isn't normal. This is like kind of freaking me out a bit. Not like anything we were doing was normal, but I knew something was going on. But soon, a worker, a support worker, a caseworker of hers noticed she had some erratic behavior and was getting suspicious that she was back on drugs. So she also realized that a bunch of her belongings were gone. She had taken a flat screen TV with me on the bus to sell to a drug dealer for crack and fentanyl, and she had also sold her laptop to a drug dealer for fentanyl. But when the worker inquired about where her stuff went, she told them that I forced her to sell it all. And not only that, she told her I forced her to do sex work. That's when they called the cops. After that, I didn't hear from her, and a couple of months went by. I had a feeling something was going on. Okay, I had a feeling I was being watched. In my gut, I knew, because I had heard from other people in the building, that she'd called the cops and made those accusations. So I knew I was being investigated. I almost didn't care because I was fucking sick. I actually remember calling a drug dealer who I knew was involved in trafficking, a very notorious trafficker in our community, and asking him if what I did was human trafficking. And he said yes. And in that moment, I knew I was going to fucking jail. December of 2020, I got arrested. I had been on like this 5-day bender, and I was coming into my apartment lobby and I heard my name. I turned around and there was these plainclothes detectives there to arrest me. The charges? 9 counts of human trafficking, trafficking of crack, and trafficking of fentanyl, which at the time really confused me because I was like, bitch, I ain't no drug dealer. The fuck? I'm a crackhead. And apparently, because I took her money, like she asked, and went and bought drugs with it and brought the drugs back to her, that's trafficking. Who knew? So after I got arrested and I'd been sitting in jail for over 3 months, I was absolutely terrified. I thought I had ruined my life. I remember being in the interrogation room with the arresting officer for hours. I just kept repeating, I didn't do this. I am a mother of 3 little girls. I'm a victim of exploitation myself. I am a sex worker. I am not a trafficker. They didn't care. Because I was a woman, I'm pretty sure they wanted to make an example of me. Also, because of who the father of my child was, a man who at the time was serving prison time for human trafficking, I'm pretty sure they thought I was a madam. I was absolutely not. I was just a sex worker and an addict trying to make money for drugs, and I was helping other girls make money for drugs. And I also want to make something very clear, because people have asked me this before. Did I get my victims permission to tell this story? And the truth is, her story and my story have nothing to do with each other at all. Her narrative and what actually happened are not exactly the same thing. I pled guilty to what I was guilty of. Taking her money knowing it was made in the commission of sex work. I didn't force her to do anything. I didn't withhold her medication. And when a wellness check was done one night, at a time she said she was being forced to do sex work in my apartment, she was actually found in her apartment, safe, sleeping in her bed, not being held against her will. What I've come to learn that a lot of people in active addiction, sometimes to save face or out of fear, they put accusations on other people. And this was not the first time she had done this. When I was in jail, I was on range with a girl who knew her, who told me that she had gotten all caught up in the same shit, the same accusations, the same charges. She said they were all in a trap house. That girl was there. A John called, and the girl said, "Hey, does anybody want to make $100 with this dude?" And the girl went. But then she turned around and said she was forced. And the girl I was in jail with got arrested for human trafficking. So that's why I have a hard time feeling guilt about not asking her permission to tell my story, because her narrative and mine are not the same. So my lawyer assured me that if I continued to stay sober after I got out of jail, that I had a really good chance at beating these charges, or at least a number of these charges. Because a lot of her story and her timeline just didn't add up. At times, she told the police that I was forcing her to do calls. Like I said, she was found fine, safe in her apartment. But actually, not only that, but we were seen on camera together bringing that big TV on the bus to the drug dealer. Nobody was forcing her to be there, and nobody was forcing her to do any of these things. But in the end, the Crown decided that I was going to have to plead to one human trafficking charge, material benefit. I took her money knowing it was made in the commission of sex work. And I was absolutely terrified that this charge was going to ruin my life, because I said I'm a mom. But I knew in spring of 2021, when I got out of jail, I was going to either have to get better or I was going to die. Or I was going to end up in prison for years, because there's a mandatory minimum of 5 years in the pen for what they were charging me with. But I was lucky. I only ended up with 1 year's house arrest for the charges. I had a really good probation officer too. She gave me leniency so I could still be a mom. I could take my kids to school. I could do extracurricular activities with them. She allowed me to create structure in my life, something that I had went without for years. So I stayed on house arrest at my parents' with my children. And when I got custody of my 2 oldest daughters and we moved out on our own, I was on probation for 2 more years without incident. And since then, I've made this my mission to educate people on what human trafficking actually is. It's not what you see on Netflix. Okay? It's not the movie Taken. It's not the movie Freedom of Hope. Sometimes trafficking is just a boyfriend making his girlfriend do calls for drugs. Sometimes it's a drug dealer allowing a female addict to rack up a drug debt and then make her work it off, turning tricks. And sometimes it's a drug dealer trading sex for drugs. And sometimes it's a dealer helping one of their female customers make money through sex work, knowing every dime she made was going back to him. For me, sex work and addiction weren't separate in my life. They were part of the same cycle. It started because I was sick. It continued because I was exploited, but through it all, I made choices I regret deeply. Okay, I faced charges and consequences. So I ask you to look into the Human Trafficking Act of Canada and see how it's made up of offenses that can criminalize women who are just trying to survive one of the most debilitating mental health crises a human can experience: substance abuse. Most of us weren't out there trying to hurt people. We were just trying to survive. We were trying not to be sick. I have witnessed countless acts of human trafficking in the 18 years that I was out there, but I've never seen someone be kidnapped. Ever. I've never seen someone drugged and then forced to perform sex acts like a slave. I truly believe that if we start looking at human trafficking for what it really is, not the sensationalized version we see in movies, but the reality of what is right the fuck in front of us, it changes everything. And I've given you so many examples of what to look for. Women caught in active addiction with intimate partners who are also in active addiction. Women whose drug dealers are not only selling them poison, but conspiring to get them into the sex trade, knowing all the money they made would go right back to them. Like I said, the amount of women who have reached out to me since I started sharing my story is actually crazy. Okay, so many have told me the same thing, that their boyfriends or dealers controlled them, traded sex for drugs, or trapped them in debt and then made them work it off doing sex work. If we're willing to see trafficking for what it truly is, we'll realize it's not only strangers in chains. Most of the time, it's much closer to home. In closing, I want to say this. I know there are hundreds of women in this country currently stuck in the vicious cycle of sex work and addiction. I know there are women who brought other women into the sex trade, not out of malice, but out of desperation. I hear from these women every single day. And I implore people not to vilify these women before hearing their testimonies. And now I'm going to speak to the woman still out there. The one who can't remember the last time she slept safe. The one who keeps saying just one more hit, one more date, one more call. The one who looks in the mirror and barely even recognizes herself. I need you to hear me. You are not what happened to you, okay? You are not what you had to do. You are not the names that you were called, or the bruises, or the mug shots, or the dope sickness. You're a human being. You're a daughter, maybe a mother, maybe a sister, but above all, you are still worthy of love. I know it's impossible. It feels impossible. I know it feels like you sold every piece of yourself just to survive. But listen, your story's not finished. There is a part of you they could never take away, a flame that never went out. And that part of you, the real you, she's still there. And she's waiting. If nobody told you today, I see you. You are valuable. You are redeemable. And when you're ready, when you're finally tired of dying, there is a way out. I am living proof. And if I can find my way back after 18 years out there, so can you. Thank you so much, Chi Miigwech.